If the Chicago Bears are going to draft a wide receiver early in the NFL draft, then it's Jaxon Smith-Njigba from Ohio State, or it's nobody.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And on the show today, I want to get into the wide receiver position for the Bears in the NFL draft and why there are plenty in this draft, but it feels to me like you either take Jaxon Smith-Njigba in the first round or you wait until day 3 of the draft. To me, this isn't a spot where the class and the Bears' positional needs align to take a wide receiver anywhere in between. I think JSN is worth it at the top of this draft, and I think there are certainly some day 3 wide receivers worth taking a flyer on where it's much less of a risk and a low risk investment to maybe try and get somebody who can develop. But the guys that fall kind of in between that are much less of a sure thing but still require a fairly significant draft pick investment are not worth it in my eyes. This is both, I think, equal parts a certain confidence in Jaxon Smith-Njigba, but perhaps even larger so a reflection on where the Bears are at the wide receiver position, what they have, what they could use, what they need, and how that aligns with this year's draft. Because I certainly understand the argument that I've heard from many that the Bears should not take a wide receiver whatsoever, certainly not at least in the first round, because they just traded for DJ Moore from the Carolina Panthers. He should be your clear-cut number 1. You've got Darnell Mooney entering the last season of his rookie deal, but expected to negotiate a potential contract extension at some point this offseason. He'll be a really solid number 2 for you. And then you have Chase Claypool, who was quite disappointing last season after being traded from the Pittsburgh Steelers, but there's some varying levels of optimism that he can get back to the high level of play that we saw him do early in his football career, and that he too can be a solid number 2/number 3 option. Then you have Velus Jones, the 3rd-round pick last year, as a potential sort of maybe number 4 with Equanimeous St. Brown back from last year as well as a potential number 4, number 5, both guys maybe having a role on special teams. And it's certainly not a position that you look at right now and say it's a big need for the Chicago Bears. It is important to keep in mind that both Claypool and Mooney are still currently both set to become free agents next offseason. And so until those contract extensions are signed, if those contract extensions are signed, there's always that chance that one, and probably less likely both, could be elsewhere in 2024, and that this, it's a low likelihood, but still a possibility that both of those receivers, or at least one, could be gone after this year. And there's a reason to add another young wide receiver who can be one of the longer-term building blocks, just in case Claypool or Mooney is a short-term piece on this team right now. But part of this problem is that the Bears do have bigger needs across the roster. And so especially with the 9th overall pick, and when we're talking in the first round, you want to get a guy that's going to be able to make a high impact. We've been talking, it's been a running theme in recent episodes of this podcast as we've talked about the offensive line position, as we've talked through the big board, as we've talked about trying to find difference makers, impact players that, especially with that 9th overall pick, you don't completely ignore positional value in the sense that you don't want to draft a quarterback, and personally, you're not going to draft a running back or a safety with those picks because the Bears, or even a linebacker, because the Bears just don't have a good spot for him and it's not a good use of that draft pick. But outside of that, with the first round pick especially, you kind of feel like you can get away with taking a player that might be at a position that isn't as huge of a need, like wide receiver, but also like cornerback has been in that conversation as well, because it's just the opportunity to get a player that you feel like is a top 10 talent. And I think Jaxon Smith-Njigba is the wide receiver that fits the bill this season. There was a tweet out yesterday from the director of the Senior Bowl, Jim Nagy, who tweeted that he thinks the NFL media is valuing this wide receiver class higher than the rest of the NFL. And he said he talked to a handful of teams, or whatever, I don't remember his phrasing, several teams that had one first-round grade on one wide receiver, and that was Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And then, of course, that means none of the other wide receivers had first-round grades for them. I've heard conflicting information. I'm not here to say that Jim Nagy is wrong. We both are coming from different positions, and there's a game of telephone that comes with sources and talking to teams and people in the know that I've heard some teams, if not many teams, have a higher grade than that on Quentin Johnston from TCU, and I expect him to go earlier than some people think he might, even though I don't personally see it. But to me, JSN is that receiver that's worth it for the Bears there. He is that guy who, despite having more Mooney and Claypool on your roster, if you draft JSN in the first round, he is good enough right away that he will play a big role in this offense. He is good enough to take snaps away from Chase Claypool and to take snaps away from Darnell Mooney, if we're being honest with you. He's probably not going to take DJ Moore's snaps away in any way, but JSN has not only the immediate impact to be able to take snaps away from those guys and have that play this year, rookie year of his career, but has the potential to be then a 1,000-yard receiver out of the slot, to be an Amon-Ra St. Brown, to be a Cooper Kupp type. He's such a skilled, polished route runner right away. To me, there's very low bust potential for someone like JSN. He's shifty. He can make plays after the catch. He maybe doesn't have the top end speed, but he's not slow. He's just closer to average speed, which is fine to me. That doesn't stop these guys from being incredibly productive in the NFL. And I think there's a real value that he could provide this Bears offense that they don't quite have with these other guys. Mooney can play the slot. Moore can play the slot. Like Chase Claypool can play the slot. Sorry, I blanked on his name. But they're not the same style of like shifty underneath security blanket type weapons for Justin Fields in that same way. Plus, by the way, college teammate briefly with Justin Fields. So I think we've talked enough about JSN. I didn't want to use a lot of time to break down why he would be a good idea, but more so the point being, he's the one wide receiver in this class that you feel really good about being able to break through the Mooney, Claypool, Moore wide receiving core to have an impact in year one and for years to come. A lot of the other wide receivers after JSN certainly have the potential and a lot of things to like about them. And I'm not saying none of them are any good or worth a team drafting, but none of them are as sure of a thing and as ready of a thing and as solid of an option to be able to come into Chicago and instantly crack that lineup and then be a big part of the wide receiver lineup for years and years to come without at least some sort of question mark, red flag, or just something to keep your eye on that makes you raise an eyebrow that you just don't really have as much with a guy like Jaxon Smith-Njigba. So we'll look at some of the other wide receivers, particularly like in the second round, and explain why it's just not worth using those picks there for this Bears team next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. FanDuel is here to help the baseball season be that much more exciting with MLB action now underway at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. So when you place your first bet, if you don't win with that first bet, FanDuel will give you up to $1,000 back in bonus bets so you can keep playing and keep the games rolling. Not just baseball season, though, of course. The NBA playoffs are getting started. We've got the NHL playoffs right around the corner. You can even bet on the NFL draft, the XFL, and the upcoming football season as well, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. So don't miss your chance to get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the Major League Baseball, NBA, and NFL. I certainly think there's a lot to like about the wide receivers available to the Bears in the second round and maybe even the early third round. I sort of grouped together their third round pick because it's 64th overall. I treat those in my brain as like 3 second round picks, but really it's 2 second round picks and a third round pick. But in the top 64, there are a number of talented wide receivers. It's a fairly deep wide receiver class in that regard. And I'm not here to say these guys are terrible and should not be picked. But specifically for the Chicago Bears, I don't think taking a wide receiver that might have a few more question marks or flaws, red flags is such a strong word, right? It carries a lot of weight, but like all of these second round wide receivers, there's a reason why, but even really some of these guys might be first round picks, but just not top 10, top 15 type wide receivers. All these next tier of wide receivers after JSN, there's a reason why they're a tier down. And it's enough of a pause or a hesitation there that it just doesn't seem like the right fit for the Chicago Bears. So like the distinction I want to make here is that JSN is worth it in the first round for me because of how sure of a thing his profile fits as a wide receiver. That the floor is high, but you also feel like the ceiling is high enough. Maybe it's not, he's never going to be a number one. He's never going to be Randy Moss. He's never going to be Justin Jefferson, but he could very well be Cooper Kupp or Amon-Ra St. Brown, who are both 1,000-yard receivers, and Cooper Kupp led the NFL in receiving yards one year. So it's a high enough ceiling with a really high floor at wide receiver that I feel like, yes, he can be best player available at 9 and be a wide receiver that makes an impact on your team for 10, 15 years. That's why he's worth the first round pick to me. Every other wide receiver in this draft has enough of that question mark where it's like, okay, the Bears are not in a position right now to use one of their 4 top 64 picks on a wide receiver that has a that has a question there, because you need, if you're going to use one of these picks on a wide receiver, they need to crack the lineup right away and be well worth playing over Claypool and Mooney. You can't afford to use a second round pick on a guy who's going to be your number 4 wide receiver this season, or a first round pick for that matter. But you can't afford to use any of your top 64 draft picks. There are 4 picks in the top 64 on a wide receiver that's going to sit 4th on the depth chart. To me, JSN is the only one who's surely not going to sit 4th on the depth chart. Certainly you can make an argument for a lot of these other guys that they could very well be ahead of Chase Claypool and or Darnell Mooney on the Bears depth chart. But it's a little bit less of a sure thing, and as you get farther and farther down the draft to the 53rd overall pick, it becomes less and less of a sure thing, right? You can start to characterize or categorize these guys into a few different buckets. And I don't want to sit here and do like the full in-depth scouting report on everybody. I'm intentionally kind of glossing over this a little bit because it's not, to me, it's not as important to get into the weeds of like, okay, why, Quentin Johnston, or why Zay Flowers, or why Cedric Tillman, or why, some of these other guys might be this and might not be that. To me, it's like JSN is sort of the polished thing here. Everybody else has little things that you can kind of get concerned with. So there's a couple buckets here, right? And not to say that all these receivers are equal, but there's different builds and molds here. You've got like these vertical receivers that are a little bit unpolished, generally the bigger guys. Quentin Johnston from TCU, 6'4", 225 pounds or whatever. Kind of, I don't want to compare him directly to Kevin White, but it has that similar sort of description of just like big, fast, but didn't really run a very complicated route tree in college. And you wonder if there's gonna need to be some polishing to come to the NFL. And he too doesn't play as big as he's listed. He's not as like a physical, as good of a jump ball winner. He body catches a lot. It's like there's enough of these questions. Like Quentin Johnston could be a number 1 wide receiver and be great if he cleans things up. But it's if he cleans things up. JSN doesn't really have an if. The question is how good. It's not will he be good, it's how good. And with Quentin Johnston, it's like he can be very good if he does this, which he very well might be. But the Bears aren't in a position to draft a wide receiver with that big of an if there. Jalen Hyatt from Tennessee doesn't have the same size. He's about 6 feet tall, not quite the 6'4", but like, fast, outside, down the sideline type of vertical wide receiver. Even his college teammate, Cedric Tillman, I think he's 6'3". These guys are vertical downfield guys that you get excited about as being more in that number 1 wide receiver mold that JSN is not. And certainly I'm more than willing to agree with people. If you say those guys have a higher ceiling than Jaxon Smith-Njigba, you may be right. I'm not going to argue too much against that, but all 3 of those guys, will there be a learning curve towards them being able to apply that in the NFL? And then, how long will it take? And there's just a question there. And there's a reason why, guys like Hyatt and Tillman especially are more like second round guys. And Quentin Johnston could very well fall and be a second round guy. You also have another bucket of receivers. Those are the big vertical guys. You've also got like the small, undersized, fast receivers all in the same range. Zay Flowers from Boston College, Josh Downs from North Carolina, and Tyler Scott from Cincinnati. All sub 6 foot receivers, a little bit on the slender side, but fast, explosive. And we don't need to, I don't put them all in the exact same level in terms of how you scout them. Some are, I think Zay Flowers is a bit ahead of the other 2, but they fit a similar archetype where it's like, okay, they're smaller and faster, but there's some limitations there as well. Like how big of a role can a smaller, faster wide receiver play in that regard? And certainly very good players and reason to like them, but are they going to crack the lineup right away as like guys who are really going to be above 4 in the depth chart? Or are they going to be guys that get certain packages early in their career and find some ways onto the field, but are still kind of the number 4 option, but have some plays designed for them and some different opportunities to get the ball in their hand? To me, the Bears have bigger needs that they need to address in the second round. Especially if you're going to take, if you're thinking about JSN as a potential first round option, obviously you wouldn't double up at that point, but like if the first round is going to be a best player available type spot, if you get a cornerback there, a wide receiver, or even if you take a tackler or an edge rusher, like in the second round, you got to make sure you leave your first 4 picks with an offensive tackle and a defensive lineman or 2, and maybe a cornerback and maybe another offensive lineman. Like you need to start filling some needs with these picks, and to use one of those picks on a wide receiver that might not have as big of a need being filled is a little bit tough when they're not going to crack the lineup. We'll throw in Jordan Addison from USC. Like to me, he's kind of like a smaller, I don't want to say he's a smaller version of JSN because they're not the same receiver at all, but like similarly like a good route runner for sure, but not as big and not as thick. And I think he body catches a bit more than the JSN. And I don't think he's quite as savvy at setting up his route trees and stuff. I mean, some people have Jordan Addison as the number 1 wide receiver in this draft, and I totally get it and totally understand it. I like JSN a bit more. And I know there's a pretty big Rashee Rice contingency out there from SMU, because he's a guy who, I've been watching his SMU tape a lot, and there's times he looks like a number 1 receiver, man. Like he goes up and high points the ball, can win vertically, can win underneath, can win after the catch. And there's times when he just kind of disappears. And there's times when, the concentration's not there. And we saw him down at the Senior Bowl. It was the same kind of thing. Like when he really wanted to and was really trying hard, he looked great. And there was times when he just wasn't. And I don't know. I don't like to question guys that, you haven't actually talked to or spoke to, but he gives me the vibes of a wide receiver that, does he love the little things about football? Does he love the dirty work? Does he love, practicing hard as you play? Like I didn't necessarily see that at the Senior Bowl. So I have some concerns about him as well in that regard. So all this is to say, like, there's a lot of guys to like in the second round, and they'll make other teams very happy. But given all the talent the Bears have at wide receiver, you're just taking JSN at 1 or in the first round because he can add to that talent and lift that talent. Whereas a lot of these second round wide receivers start to be more like added to the pile of talent that you have and aren't necessarily giving you a lot more right away. It'd be more like a wide receiver insurance policy, which isn't quite worth the pick when the Bears have other big needs that they need to fill. That's not to say they shouldn't consider drafting wide receivers at all. I still think, especially once you get into day 3, after the Bears' 3rd round pick, you get into their 4th and 5th and 6th round picks, there's some wide receivers in this class that I'd absolutely worth taking a flyer on, knowing that they're going to be your number 4 wide receiver or number 5 wide receiver, but just to add more depth as more of that insurance policy, we'll go through a few of my favorite names, some guys that we should keep an eye on as potential sleeper picks, or maybe some sleepers, some a little bit more well-known, but definitely like 4th round and beyond, next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by Ultimate Pro Football GM. It is a free mobile game app we've been talking about quite a bit here on the podcast, and it's a lot of fun because it puts you in complete control of your own NFL franchise. If you've ever dreamed about being a general manager, this game is for you because you get to decide in the draft, okay, am I taking a wide receiver in the first round? Am I waiting to the second or third? Am I trying to just get a sleeper in late day 3 of the draft? What decisions do I make in free agency? Who do I sign? Who do I trade? What coaches do I hire and fire? How do I set even ticket prices and advertising? You have total control all in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline, so you can play on the go as you want, whenever you want to. Right now, Locked On Bears listeners are going to get a 100% free boost to your franchise when you use our promo code Locked On in the game store. That's all caps, Locked On. So make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. I think once you get past the Bears' 64th overall pick, you get into the 4th, 5th round, fully on board with taking a wide receiver in that spot, which, by the way, I feel the same about running back. I don't want a running back in the top 64 picks. I mean, you got to get defensive line and offensive line. If there's no defensive line or offensive line there, and really even no cornerbacks there. We can start to talk about like Zach Charbonnet or Jahmyr Gibbs if they happen to be there. But realistically, fourth round and beyond is where I'm good with wide receiver and tight end, or wide receiver and running back. I'd consider tight end in the second round because it's such a strong class, but not the point. The point is today, wide receivers. And certainly if any of those guys that we talked about already fell all the way into the fourth round, which I don't think so. I mean, maybe a Tyler Scott, Cedric Tillman, Josh Downs type on the lower end of that spectrum, it's possible could make it to the fourth round, but I would be very, very surprised across the board there. Even Rashee Rice, like, don't think so. Certainly if any of those guys fell, they would instantly be a best player available type conversation that I'm willing to have there. But other guys that I don't want to put like a grade on there where I'm just going to say like, okay, I'm taking this guy in the fourth round if he's there. It's more like guys on day 3 of the draft. It kind of depends on how the rest of the class goes. But guys I would be interested in taking a flyer on because they intrigue me in some way and feel like they're worth taking later in the draft because the risk is so much less. Yeah, if you draft this receiver, even in the fourth round, if you miss on him, it sucks. You'd like to hit on all your fourth round picks, but it's not like, man, the Bears really wasted that great opportunity. They could have had so many great players and ended up with this guy. Well, by the time you get to the fourth round, but especially fifth and sixth, it's a lot more lottery tickets, swing for the fences anyway. So why not swing for the fence on wide receivers that you feel like have something about them that feels a little bit special or feels like there's something there that you're hoping to be able to get even more out of. First name I'll throw out there, Nathaniel Dell from Houston, also called Tank Dell, which is funny because he's 5'8", 165 pounds. But Tank Dell is legit. I mean, for a 5'8", 165-pound guy, a guy who some teams will just say, sorry, you are just too physically small to play in the NFL. He's lighter than Tariq Cohen. Like, he's very small. But he is so fast and so explosive and does it as a really good route runner. That's the key here, right? We've seen plenty of receivers, or running backs too, but especially receivers, that are just super sprinter athletes that can change, like explosive and change direction really, really well, but like they don't know a lick about running routes. Like they're fast, they're just great athletes who can kind of catch the ball, and you have to teach them how to use that speed in a way that's going to be effective. Nathaniel Dell, I mean, he smoked every cornerback at the Senior Bowl this year. And certainly this is not purely based on what we saw at the Senior Bowl, but it's certainly the Senior Bowl confirms like, okay, we were kind of wondering after watching him at Houston, can he do this against NFL caliber talent? When you're 5'8", 165, Houston's not a tiny school by any means, but they're not playing Alabama every week. So, how well is that going to work against more consistently NFL quality players? And the Senior Bowl is at least an opportunity, not that everyone is going to be an NFL starter, but guys that are going to be drafted or certainly get a chance as an undrafted free agent, the top of the top cornerbacks heading into the NFL. And he smoked every single one of them. I mean, he plays at a different speed. It looks like he's on fast forward and everyone else is in slow motion when he runs routes, makes plays after the catch. And for a guy who's 165 pounds, he was tackled a lot because he had the ball so much at Houston and was surprisingly durable. So I'm not as concerned that he's just going to break down after taking a certain number of hits in the NFL. I mean, it's certainly a possibility, and certainly college is not. I keep saying certainly. I don't know why I'm leaning on that right now. College is not always an indicator of injury in the NFL. Like, plenty of guys have been durable in college and get hurt in the NFL, and plenty of guys have been injured in college and then find durability again in the professionals. And that's where I go to another wide receiver who that fits the bill for him perfectly. Michael Wilson from Stanford. The main red flag on his resume is injuries. Like, I don't know that he played a full college season any of his 4 seasons. He was hurt a lot, and that's a very good reason not to draft a player, or at least a very good reason to wait to draft a player. There are very legitimate concerns about his medicals. Is he a guy who's just unlucky and just happened to kind of get all these things back to back to back? And as he gets in the NFL and continues to grow into his body and continues to work on an NFL nutrition system and kind of get more settled in football as a career, maybe the bad luck stops and he holds on to it, or maybe there's just something about him that is fragile in some way physically that he can't control, and he'll never be able to stay healthy in the NFL. That's what makes him a real wild card in this draft, because otherwise he is 6'2", 215 pounds, big, strong, tough, physical receiver who runs great routes and can high point jump balls down the sideline and keep his good body control to stay in bounds. Also a very willing and physical blocker. Like, he checks so many of the boxes that you look for in a wide receiver. He's not fast. He's like 4.5 speed. He's average speed at best. So no, he's not going to win any huge foot races down the sideline. But I mean, size, route running, hands, toughness, jump ball ability, blocking, like that's exactly what the Bears want in a wide receiver. And the question there really is the health. And man, if he's there, fifth round, I don't. He might go in the fourth, but like I'm willing to take a chance on that, because if he was a guy who was healthy throughout his college career, I mean, he's at least a second round pick, if not a first round pick, given the kind of talent that we've seen him play when he's healthy. I mean, there's absolutely something there. It's just a matter of how many games of it are you going to get in the pros? Like, to me, he and Dell are guys that would come in right away and might not instantly crack playing time ahead of DJ Moore or Darnell Mooney or Chase Claypool, but they're worth taking because they can add something to your offense and be really good value if they pan out in the NFL the way we saw them play in college. One guy who's a bit more developmental that you wonder, maybe not going to make a huge impact right away, but a guy, A.T. Perry from Wake Forest, is a name that I think is becoming a more and more popular name as a sleeper in this draft. He too, like 6'3.5-ish, 200 pounds, really long arms as a wide receiver, just a super wide catch radius. And I feel like he runs pretty darn good routes too for a guy his size. But because he can get open pretty well and has such long arms, he can make these difficult catches away from his body to where your quarterback doesn't have to be pinpoint accurate. He's not a dynamic athlete in very many ways. He's not fast. He's not super explosive, but he's got a knack for moving before the catch, and he's got great catch radius and long arms. So I feel like he's a guy who can come in, and he's never going to be explosive or dynamic enough to be a number one guy, and maybe at best could be a number two guy, but is always going to be reliable for you. Like, to me, that's well worth a 5th, 6th round pick later in this draft, just to get somebody in there that you like that can make plays, can make catches for your quarterback and make his job a little bit easier. There's a number of other guys who are like big, long, tall, fast vertical receivers that are late round guys, like the West Virginia kid and a few others that like, they're just like poor man's versions of Quentin Johnston, where it's like, yeah, they're not quite as big or as fast, but still just as raw, that you take one of those guys in this 5th, 6th, 7th round, kind of sit them on the bench for the first year or two while you've got Moore, Mooney, and Claypool ahead of them on the depth chart. You don't need your 5th, 6th, 7th round rookie to be great right away at wide receiver. So let them learn, let them kind of build out their route running especially, but there's a lot of receivers late in this draft that have the physical tools of height, weight, speed, size, and just need to learn more like route running and the finer techniques of wide receiver play that I think would also be well worth the Bears using a late round draft pick on. And that's where I sort of come back to my bigger point. It's JSN in the first round, or it's wait to a later round wide receiver that you don't need to be great as a late round pick. Everything else kind of in the middle. I don't think it's worthwhile for the Bears when you have as much talent as they do at receiver and have as many other needs as they do to use those picks. And it's a draft class where these receivers have enough little question marks or ifs or buts or what ifs and maybe red flags, however you want to describe them. That's where I think the Bears should handle the wide receiver position. We'd love to hear what you think if you disagree. If you're a Zay Flowers guy or a Quentin Johnston guy or Jordan Addison or Rishi Rice or you like one of these other wide receivers, let me know in the comments on the YouTube video on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel for this podcast. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears. You can post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group as well to keep the conversation going there. However you do it, just make sure you're subscribed to Locked On Bears wherever you're listening, or if you're watching right now on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. Those are all going to be the best ways to keep up with our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. If you're looking for your second listen, check out our Locked On NFL Scouting podcast. Our guys Joe Marino and Kyle Krabs, friends of the show, they break down the league from certainly from the league-wide perspective, but from a team-building perspective on what these types of what roster moves matter and positional value in the draft and free agency and trades, salary cap fits, scheme fits, and so much more. They've been talking some Odell Beckham Jr. to the Ravens and so much more. So go check out Locked On NFL Scouting wherever you get your podcasts. Come on back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears and another opportunity for you to bear down.